Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture where we're going to be talking about, fairly briefly, the Civil War and related images in art of the mid to later 19th century in the United States. I want to re-emphasize the idea that, of course, landscape painting was the predominant genre of this time, but of course, there are other things that are on the American consciousness that show up in the art as well. And it seems like a good time to spend a few moments talking about one of the biggest things that happened in the 19th century, the American Civil War. So, of course, one way to put this is to say that for a very long time, in colonial America even, and certainly after the coming together of this nation, the question of slavery had been around. A lot of people have been talking about it for a very long time. For instance, as early as 1787, we had a organization known as the Free African Society. By 1826, there was an association known as the General Colored Association that was made up of members of both white and black peoples, arguing for what generally is talked about as abolition. The big one, though, is 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was largely made up of evangelicals, again, both blacks and whites, arguing against the sinful nature of slavery. Remember, we brought this up before, that the English, who had outlawed slavery supposedly years and years before, although continued to practice the slave trade through, kind of clandestinely, through allowing various business interests to benefit from and profit from slaving, nonetheless held Americans to a standard that said we were being hypocritical if we argued for our innate right to be free and liberated as, again, U.S. citizens from the reigns of the British Empire, when in fact we owned people ourselves. So it had been around for a long time, but of course the sticking point was, frankly, that the entire economy of the South was based upon an agricultural system that needed the basically free labor of slaves, and had massively benefited from this, of course. And this had, I want to put it this way, there had already existed races, and we've seen this in a number of different ways in our lectures here, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this. The belief of whites that they were superior to the other races. I'm sorry, I still see it around quite a bit today, frankly, maybe not as overtly, but certainly oftentimes, showing up a little implicitly in places. This, when it is supported by business interests, by people making a profit, tends to even naturalize such prejudices further. And so, to justify your owning of another people, you point to supposed natural conditions of differences between the peoples. You point to ideas that are completely, to me, baffling, that say that these people, primarily, originally Africans, were benefiting in some way from slavery. And we're going to see a couple of instances of that today. What then precipitates the Civil War? We're talking about primarily some of these images of blacks at the time. And again, just so you know the way that these racial designations or ethnic designations are used, the term black can be used today to designate a kind of cultural identity where people of a particular color will identify as black. The term African American is a really generic term that we use in the United States to designate people who originally had ancestry, supposedly, in Africa. Originally, though, during the period that we're talking about here, African American meant, later generations of slaves that had oftentimes mixed with whites, primarily through the rape of slave women, and then these offspring were called African American. Again, the prejudice went like this, and I know it's hard for many of us to fathom, but if you had supposedly even one drop of black blood, you were African American and could be owned as property. And a lot of these things were, of course, sadly justified again in legal terms by the famous Dred Scott decision of 1857, where the Supreme Court held that, against the popular belief of the time, that just because you had escaped and maybe lived for years in a free state in the North primarily, did not mean that you were a real citizen. In fact, the Dred Scott decision basically said that blacks couldn't possibly be understood as citizens, thus they had no legal right to even sue in a court of law, and were not free just because they had lived in a free state. Again, that's as late as 1857. Now, a couple of other things to kind of point to here. A lot of what kind of led to the Civil War was an anxiety about what was going to happen as more and more states came into the Union, particularly from the West. We've been talking a little bit about, this manifest destiny idea of moving out west, prospering by making use of those natural resources. A lot of these areas out west started to become territories, many of them around the time of the Civil War, in particular California, gained statehood. Now, the deal was that every time a state came into the Union, an argument would be made as to whether this would be a free state, meaning did not hold slaves, or a slave-owning state. And as, again, tides were turning against the South, and they began to be anxious about more states coming into the Union that would be free states, thus tipping the balance in favor of the possible, really possible, abolitionist movement, getting rid of slavery altogether. Push started coming to shove. In 1859, to try to push this over the edge, just to give us more of this context, John Brown, famously with a group of both whites and blacks, raided Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, which was part of the site of the American Armory, in order to get arms to arm slaves. Again, this has been fomenting for a long time. People were really anxious about this. He was caught and executed, but, people started to see, the signs on the horizon here. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, that's when really the South got incredibly anxious, and we see the Civil War really erupting. They knew that this man, was likely to favor with the free states, and again, they saw the tides turning against them, and they pushed for a secession from the overall United States in order to, and again, there's more to this. It's a very complex set of issues, but the big one was around slave owning, and they wanted to control their ability to own slaves and run the economy the way that they wanted, which is based upon agricultural trade, much more than things that were happening in the North, based upon importing, exporting, lots of technological trade, and a much more varied economy up north. So I just wanted to set those things out there, and now let's get on to some of the art and talk about this. The first image that I want to talk about on your lecture guide is this famous work that was what you're looking at here is actually the study that is talked about in your reading from Emanuel Lutz, called Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, also affectionately known as Westward Ho. Again, this is the sketch that he produced in 1860. He started it in 1860, but he finished it in 1861. It was a commission by, again, the U.S. government, as many of these things were, in order to decorate the Capitol building. And in particular, this one is installed in the House of Representatives, or not this one, but the one that comes from this sketch. I show you the sketch first to show you what changes. And again, Lutz has been trained in the classical tradition. He's trying to mix that together a little bit with landscape painting. So we see settlers moving in their covered wagons coming out of the east, and you see the mountains here, the Continental Divide. Crossing those mountains, again, you get a little bit of Albert Bierstadt in there, the beautiful, majestic mountains in the middle of the country. They've made it past, and they can see the coastline. So we've gotten all the way out to the coast, and the sun is rising, which is a symbol of prosperity and tomorrow. And this is, again, their manifest destiny. They are going to be putting to use all these natural resources, and I hope you can see this, but following my cursor, these guys are already chopping up trees, not just getting them out of their way, but also going to put those things to use. What he ended up producing a couple of years later is a lot more complicated picture, and I bring you in this not very great copy of it here because it's huge. It's 20 by 30 feet across, a kind of mural painted on the wall, because I wanted to show you a couple of things that you can't see in the picture I'm going to show you in a minute. On each side here, follow my cursor, on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are two pioneers of westward movement. This is, on the left, Daniel Boone, who we've already met, and of course the famous Meriwether Lewis over on the right, kind of looking onto the scene. And then in these decorations all around are some of the things that are going to be gained from out west. There are, for instance, agricultural tools over here and mining tools over here. It's kind of like a virtual ode to manifest destiny here and what awaits us out west. I'm going to get up a little bit closer here, a better colored version so that you can see it a little bit better, and talk some more about some of the changes that occurred between the original sketch and the final version. Remember, this is painted right on the verge of the Civil War. The first version, the sketch that you saw earlier, was completed right before the Civil War. That's what people expected to get, and then the Civil War erupts in 1861. It will run through 65. And in his finished work, he shows it this way. We still have the covered wagons. We still have the beautiful, majestic mountains. We still have the sun rising over the horizon. And we've got all these covered wagons with people coming into the West. It's a really kind of masterful composition in which he's able to, I mean, this isn't the way it actually looks, of course, but he's able to kind of wrap nature around, so we get the mountains from where we're coming, and yet we get the vista off into, to the horizon and what awaits us. That's actually San Francisco, oddly rendered, but that's what he was thinking of here. So you see that, but there's one big change that's been noted, from the sketch to now. It's not just more complicated. He's added a black man here in the middle. And Emanuel Lutz, of course, as you will have read, was sympathetic with the abolitionist movement. And what he's doing here is he's showing you that something that, again, is similar to the Bierstadt work, which he wouldn't have seen because it really is being produced at the same time, but the same ideas are influencing both, which is, out west, there's room for all of us. That the black man here who is leading the white woman and her child on this donkey out into the west, saying, out west we will have a place for all people. All of these types of turmoils that are happening here on the East Coast, they won't be in effect out there on the West Coast. And of course, think of how much anxiety this would provoke to people of the South, who were rightly recognizing that more and more of the territories that were being granted statehood out west could lead to this tipping of the balance in favor of abolition. Once again, this is an illusion, right? That kind of alluding to the Holy Family that they do in the 19th century all the time. It's basically Joseph leading Mary and the Christ child out of the turmoil of, in the biblical story, Herod's Jerusalem out to Egypt. Here we have something similar. They're escaping all the turmoil out west, all the things that restrict their freedom, and the promise of the West is going to grant them this kind of liberty and prosperity and allow them to fulfill their manifest destiny, right? Now, compositionally, once again, so you know how these things work, we see that trail kind of leading us back to the mountains, and you can see how the artist has used the river to continue into this, here's where they came from. Notice how in very classical terms we built up a pyramidal form here with, at the apex, a flag being raised by this pioneer saying, I claim this territory for the United States. You will probably have read that this is fairly new, that the West was, let's say, especially the kind of Southwest, was a contested territory. We had to go through the Mexican American Wars to win. Texas, there was a lot of back and forth with the Spanish about areas that are today California. And so this is kind of like expansionist rhetoric as well. And then just a couple of other examples of this kind of representations of this time of what we would call a genre scene, a kind of everyday scene that also have indications about the way that people thought particularly about slaves or blacks at this time. This is John Crimmel's Quilting Frolic from earlier, much earlier, 1813. And I could probably bring you in, 100 examples of something that looks suspiciously like this. What you're seeing here is a typical middle-class East Coast family with all of their trappings. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see what they own. They've got books here. They have nice china here. They have nice clothing. They have on their wall, it's worth mentioning, I said this before, a portrait of George Washington. That was kind of a requisite in everyone's home. He was, after all, our first hero. Surrounded by a couple of paintings that are scenes of culture, although in this case you have two nautical scenes, one which is a battle scene showing that maybe this grandpa participated in the American Revolution, was certainly proud of his nation's heritage. They've just got done with quilting, the women, for the day. They've been working hard at this, and now it's kind of leading towards a night of festivities. Again, genre scene means, in this case, an everyday, ordinary scene of American life. What I want to point out, and what your text wants to point out, is the blacks that are shown in here. Again, I don't want to call them African Americans at this point. That's not really appropriate. And you could call them, as they would have been called at the time, Negro. I just feel like a kind of using the term that's used more today to reference people of color, of ancestry going back to Africa. Black culture is probably the most appropriate way to talk about this. But in this case, the way that they're represented is very much according to stereotypes of the time. Now, these are standard stereotypes, but Crimmel is oftentimes pointed to as one of the first to base his representations of blacks upon a very particular kind of stereotype of their physiognomy, meaning the way that they looked. He had, and many others had, been influenced by the pseudoscience, it's not even a science, of phrenology. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's basically a science, it's hocus pocus, frankly, of studying the bumps on people's heads and the shapes of their faces in order to determine their character and their character strengths and so forth. And that gave rise to the idea that particular physical characteristics of various people were indicators of their intelligence, of their morals, and on and on and on. So in this case, the stereotype that I'm talking about is, people of African ancestry have all different types of skin pigmentations, and certainly here in the United States with our African American culture and so many mixings of various ethnicities, you have massive variations. But at this time, almost always you're going to see people who are incredibly black. Again, this is right around the Revolution and in the first couple of decades after. As we go forward and people start pointing out the differences in pigmentation, generally speaking, you're thinking of people who are a lot more aware of all the variations within a culture. When you collapse everything down into just one standard stereotype, then you're thinking about probably groups of people and artists who are just thinking about these people in very simplistic terms. The big one, though, is the toothy grin and the big, very, very pink lips that don't match up to anything historically, except for stereotypes. So that's one of the big things that Crummell has kind of pointed to in the history of representations of blacks as starting this, what later becomes this kind of almost blackface stereotype. The other stereotype that's in here is blacks as entertainers. This is a very standard one, even up until today. It still crops up from time to time. The high-stepping Negro who is, playing his fiddle for other people's enjoyment. This isn't to say, like all stereotypes, that there aren't, there isn't a kind of interest in music and dancing and in entertainment among these cultures. It's just that's kind of the predominant way that they're representing, entertaining others. The other one is serving others. She's not quite, but you can imagine her growing up to be one of the standard stereotypes of black women, which is the mammy figure. The mammy, again, if you want to see these stereotypes in action, go watch a period movie like Gone with the Wind and you'll see them everywhere. She is the mammy, that is, usually the older black woman who is a proud servant serving the white family, very much kind of almost a surrogate mother taking care of the white children, seemingly kind of unconcerned with the fact that she is, whether it's during the period of slavery or after, basically beholden to the power structure as it exists. Again, I'm showing you one-offs of what are examples of numerous types of paintings within this within this kind of spectrum. So this is Nathaniel Jocelyn's Saint-Gaudens. Saint-Gaudens, some of you will know, was if you've ever seen the movie La Amistad or The Amistad, you will have heard this story. The way that this story goes is that let's see, what is the date? Wow, I don't have it off the top of my head. But in the even earlier than that. Well, look it up because I'm not necessarily, no, I am. 1839. I found my date, sorry. 1839, there is a slave ship, the La Amistad, and actually the story goes back before this, but that slave ship is taken over by the black slaves that were bound for Puerto Rico from Havana. It was a Spanish slave ship at this point, and Saint-Gaudens was basically the leader of this rebellion. The backstory of this is that the slaves themselves, who were taken from an area of Africa, the Mendi region, were taken and sold to Portuguese slavers against international treaties against slavery. So no one's enforcing these things, right? So they end up in Havana. They're transported to Puerto Rico. In the interim, Saint-Gaudens and a number of other slaves, 53 of them, take over the ship. They force the crew to turn the ship around and sail them back to Africa, but in the middle of the night. And of course, they're not navigators. They don't know. The crew moves them up the eastern seaboard and basically lands them in the area known as Long Island now, where they are captured. They're put in jail, but they are taken to trial. It actually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, who rules that they had been seized illegally. And after a short period of time kind of touring northeastern United States, they return to Africa. Now, Saint-Gaudens becomes a pretty famous character in this story. He was studied by phrenologists Again, this supposed study, pseudoscience of the characteristics of the face and the head to determine how this man, since he was black and all the presumptions that went along with being black, could have done these incredibly brave and ingenious things. And again, just to kind of push this point home, that's a phrenologist's head where, let's say you have a bump in one of these areas or a smoothness in one of these areas, supposedly you have greater ability for this or that. So they're studying this man. And then, of course, a portrait of him is commissioned by another famous black abolitionist by the name of Robert Purvis, and then Nathaniel Jocelyn makes this one. Now, the way he's represented him, you probably can tell, if this looks familiar to things we've seen before, it's because it's in the tradition of representing nobility. We saw it in the earliest of portraits. I made reference to the idea of long-standing traditions in Europe of representing noblemen kind of gazing slightly above our eye level off into the distance. And that's what's happening here. We saw it with Charles Byrd King's representations of Native Americans, and we've got the same thing happening here. Because at root, the stereotype, the firm belief of a lot of people, whether they're abolitionists or not, was that blacks, just like Native Americans and other supposedly inferior races, were inherently savage. So when you had someone act against the supposed characteristics of their race, like Cinque, suddenly phrenologists start studying him at every angle and trying to figure out why this could be the case, since it ran so counter to their stereotypes of these people. In any case, the other iconography that is at work in this has to do with where he's represented. You're seeing one of a series of versions of this. This one doesn't actually have the palm trees in the distance, but oftentimes there's palms here. He holds a cane staff in his hand, which is a symbol of the sugar canes that he would have been forced to work had he stayed in the Caribbean as a slave. That was the main crop there. And remember how I said with Benjamin West's work that the standard way to represent people in the classical tradition is to put them in togas, which seems so preposterous. But here he is in a toga to associate him with the great traditions of Greece and Rome and nobles of past cultures and drawing from that language. So moving on then, I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's kind of standard reading. It was anyway during my upbringing of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a work by Robert Scott Duncanson called Uncle Tom and Little Ava from 1853. This story, of course, of Uncle Tom's Cabin is long and varied, but the basic structure of it has to do with something that you see here. It's about Uncle Tom, who is a black slave who is beholden to Little Ava. Little Ava is the nice little white girl that you see here, who is kind of consistently trying to teach and educate her slaves, oftentimes through parables or passages in the Bible, which in this scene is what she was doing. It's an actual kind of illustration of a scene in the book. And by the way, you will see this as well in your reading, that Robert Duncanson is actually borrowed from an engraving that was an illustration for Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the versions for his painting here with slight changes to it. In any case, in the story, in this scene, little Ava is talking to Tom about reading in passages from the Bible. Here she kind of points up as if to heaven and the promised land. Her goal is to educate her slaves and to use her inheritance to buy a home in one of the freed states and kind of bring everyone there and move them away from slavery. This story, by the way, is absolutely in line with evangelicals' ideas about how blacks would be liberated. It will be whites doing the liberating. If they work together with us, we will educate them, and we'll free them, we'll emancipate them from their slavery. Now, this is a very well-intentioned idea, but it starts from the premise, of course, that and again, this is such tricky territory because, of course, slaves weren't educated in the same way that whites would have been educated at this time. They were actually forced to be de-educated in a way. You wanted them to be compliant and not use their wits because that made them easier to control. But it also is based upon a premise that they're not just not educated, they're not smart, not capable of being educated. What I'm trying to kind of trip around here is the idea that on the one hand, that is at work here that seems pretty consistent with how we saw white Americans treat Native Americans. Kind of like there's a nobility there, but they're childlike or savage at heart, or they have characteristics to their ethnicity, they would have called at the time race, that need to be overcome, and that one of the ways to overcome that is by whites kind of fostering their own education, their own religion for the blacks. And frankly, they're incredibly successful at this, as you can tell by the number of blacks who identify with Christianity in the United States and beyond. In any case, some of you know, I don't mean to be a spoiler alert here, but Ava doesn't make it. She dies. And by the way, there's a reference here. Earlier on, Ava almost drowns in the story, and you see the lake in the background. Tom saves her from that. But she has created a great example for those around her who take up her cause and try to help blacks liberate themselves from slavery and gain some kind of foothold on a better life. So in this story, and you'll read this again in the text reading, Tom on the one hand is, he helps Ava from time to time, usually with his physical strength. He's almost always beholden to her, as if she is kind of like a god on earth or an angel. And it sets up this power dynamic, which was, of course, in play, that makes it seem, again, and we've seen this before, we saw it in Benjamin West, The Death of General Wolfe, that people who are not white are kind of just beholden to whites who are superior and want to emulate them. And again, the trickiness around this is because of the power dynamic set up the way it was, where blacks were owned by whites who treated them horribly, who went out of their way not to educate them and to, frankly, create a disinterest in getting any kind of education for many of them. It did set up a relationship in which, because of the power structure being the way it was, whites were going to have to do the vast majority of the work to help blacks in this situation. However, as many of you know, this type of rhetoric, this type of idea of blacks just being passive and having to be led by whites towards their emancipation, towards their freedom and liberation, was something that a lot of people railed about even back then. It's the reason that today, for instance, the term Uncle Tom is a derogatory term referring to blacks who are compliant with whites and basically go along to get along. Fairly briefly, I wanted to bring in this work, John Rogers' Slave Auction from 1859. John Rogers primarily did small-scale little ceramic sculptures or fired clay sculptures, usually not painted at all, for popular culture. These were things that he would produce en masse, and they would be sold in stores for relatively cheap costs compared to what we're talking about. They're kind of like a popular form of art rather than some of the more kind of fine art forms that these other artists aspired to. He oftentimes tried to kind of take a lay of the land, figure out which way the wind was blowing, and produce a work of art that he thought would sell. And in this case, His work was The Slave Auction from 1859. Again, we're right on the verge of the Civil War. This was produced within weeks of John Brown's execution, the man who led the abolitionist kind of attack on Harper's Ferry. And he thought, well, there's going to be this empathy for John Brown and the abolitionist movement. After all, most people saw things moving in that direction. So he produced this work in which you see a slave auctioneer in the center, but the way he's represented the blacks, the man is very defiant and headstrong, and you get this idea that he can't believe that anyone would treat him this way. And the woman is emotional and crying and holding the crying baby, and there's even another child kind of in her skirts down here. You can't imagine that this family is going to be sold off, and the implication is separately into slavery. And he thought, well, the sympathy of the American public at this time is for abolition. Of course, many people are abolitionists. This will sell. His problem primarily was he couldn't get a lot of stores to hold this stock because, as he put it, he thought these stores were afraid of offending their Southern clients. Now, we do this all the time. We continue to do it today. It's another stereotype that's in play. It wasn't just the South, and there are many people in the South who were abolitionists too, but it wasn't just the South who held these deep-seated prejudice. You could find plenty of this in the North as well. A work that was quite successful at this time, though, and an artist who is immensely successful at these types of genre scenes of everyday life, is Eastman Johnson. This is called Negro Life in the South, or affectionately known more often than not as Kentucky Home, by Eastman Johnson, created in the same year, 1859. Johnson studied in Germany at Dusseldorf Academy and also in Holland. I bring that up because one of the traditions in the Dutch School of Painting, some of you know, is incredible amounts of realistic detail. And certainly early on in his career and in works like this, which he exhibited to critical success at the New York Academy of Design, that type of incredible detail is something that would show how skilled an artist was. Later on, as modern movements of art will influence him, his work gets more and more sketchy, as do many artists' works. In any case, before I talk about why this was so successful, I just wanted to use this as an excuse to talk about the New York Academy of Design, because by the middle of the century, in Philadelphia, there was the Pennsylvania Academy to the Arts, and in New York, there was the New York Academy of Design. And while these are two types of academies, and this is new, right? They had started at the beginning of the century, but they had really gained some success by the middle of the century. They're not nearly as big as what you would find in England or in France by any measure. But at least we have a little bit of an infrastructure now. We have our own teaching schools. We have our own places that will exhibit works of art over and over again and promote art. And when he exhibited this, he had some success. Now, along with all this incredible naturalistic detail that he has here, one of the reasons this may have been so successful is that it's pretty non-committal on the issue of slavery, which was such a big topic at the time. And I think your text does a wonderful job kind of pointing out that, let's say you were pro-abolition, this work would play for you, and if you were pro-slavery, this work would play for you too, because whatever you bring to this work tends to be supported by what you find. And what I mean by this is what you're basically looking at are interactions of blacks, probably, again, understood, we're in Kentucky, so understood to be slaves in their pastime. So, a mother figure with a baby up here above. Look at how light-skinned the baby is, though. This tends to indicate, some kind of probably woman being raped, but an African American. There's another lighter slave over here as well. kind of flirtation going on here among two younger slaves. The black entertainer playing his banjo over here, the kid dancing over here, right? Let's say you are pro-abolitionist. What you'll tend to see here is very individual, very human renderings of slaves, things that are paying attention to their way of life. You might even see all the hardships that they have to endure with this kind of rickety old house that's falling down and their shabby clothes and so forth. If you are, let's say, pro-slavery, though, you will see this and maybe see kind of stereotypes. The high-stepping Negro over here, that they're happy living in their squalor, which is just an indicator to you that these people don't have very high expectations, they don't have any ambitions, and it's kind of up to you to provide for them. Over on the far left-hand side, you see the white woman coming in her nice clothing. Again, almost a contrast to what they're wearing to set up this opposition between those who have and those who have not. And again, lead to this possibility of interpreting this according to whatever you already bring to it. I hope you'll actually look this up. I'm not going to spend any time looking at it, but you can find these everywhere so that you can actually read what the verbiage says in this. This is a anonymous work. It's not really an artwork. It's just part of visual culture called Slavery as It Exists in America, Slavery as It Exists in England. I wanted to show this to you, and I could show you again hundreds of these, because you would never believe it otherwise, that people actually believed. Remember, England, Great Britain has outlawed slavery for over 100 years at this point. And what you see over here are former slaves who are decrepit, who are begging, who are, haven't done anything with their lives. And the verbiage is basically saying, well, see, if you didn't help them out, if you didn't support them, meaning hold them as slaves, they can't do anything with their lives. Where up above, Slavery as It Exists in America suggests that, and these people are all saying this, look at how easy their lives are, how generous we are to them by providing them with work and providing them with food, and completely downplays the idea that they're owned and all the horror that goes along with being a slave. They're all just dancing and frolicking and having fun. Everyone, by the way, is shown as a racial stereotype with big lips and big eyes and giant noses. It's meant to show this basic idea that people believed quite firmly, that blacks just weren't capable of independence. And so it was up to whites, and completely beneficial for both in a way. It was a give and take to own people, so as to allow them this happy-go-lucky life that, of course, belies the reality of the time. Eastman Johnson, I love Eastman Johnson, not just for his subject matter, but for the way that he renders scenes. This is a work from a little bit later, 1862-63, called The Fugitive Slaves. See, this is what we would call painterly or loose brushstroke. It's just a sketchy quality of a night scene of slaves escaping the South during the Civil War. You can see these little white glints over here underneath the horse. Those are bayonets from rifles, and now we've got a furtive scene of slaves and the reality of their lives, not happy-go-lucky at all, having to escape to their freedom. But along with that kind of story, that fits into our larger narrative about how we're representing these scenes of slave life and slaves' reality, and which side you're on when it comes to the American Civil War. I just wanted to draw your attention to how kind of interesting this painting is as just a painting, as paint on a canvas. Similar scene here is by Theodore Kaufman, called On to Liberty, from 1867, so not long after the Civil War. Again, an academically trained artist who did a ton of scenes like this, in which what you're witnessing is a supposed scene of slaves escaping the South, moving to the North during the Civil War. And again, it's a kind of anecdotal scene in which you can see traditions that would have been ascribed to their contact with Africa, carrying things on their head, kind of brightly colored clothes, moving out of this area. It's not a scene that's fraught with a lot of anxiety. In fact, it's got a little bit of humor here. The kids don't want to go along, right? So they have to be dragged out of this area. And it's something that's kind of popularizing this story. As your text points out, there are a whole host of things that confirm that, blacks need some kind of almost parenting in order to grow. That's happening here with the children being forced to do this as if they don't know any better. And then there's little things that are meant to, of course, make you feel superior. Look at their clothing. Look at how they're walking around without any shoes. They are a savage people. And then there's some things that, frankly, whether they're definitely on purpose, but whether they're meant to be salacious or not is anyone's guess. The woman back here far off on the left who isn't covering up her breasts, associating the black body with something that can be owned, in this case for sexual purposes, that will become, frankly, a big thing all over Western Europe near the end of the century with the black entertainers that showed up in venues of Paris and so forth. Again, stereotypes, right? This is a very, very early work by one of the great artists of the 19th century, Winslow Homer. It's called Bivouac Fire on the Potomac. The Potomac is the river, of course, that goes through D.C. and beyond. And Winslow Homer was an artist who began his career as an engraver and then very quickly moved on to kind of popular illustrations, and then started taking a number of painting classes and working for big kind of commercial institutions, particularly Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly is kind of like the earliest Life or Time magazine, came out on a weekly as it suggests, was filled with engravings that were taken after paintings. And Winslow Homer, for instance, worked early on painting scenes of the Civil War that were then turned into, and sometimes he had a hand in this, turned into engravings that would provide illustrations for this weekly illustrated magazine. So in Bivouac Fire, you have, it's really just simple. All I wanted to point out was early on the consistency of him playing with or playing along with ethnic stereotypes. In this case, you've got the entertaining dancer, right? The high-stepping Negro, and over here you've got the other black performer playing his fiddle here to entertain the troops. You don't see blacks really fighting, even though they did fight. They're just put into the role of entertainers. I'm going to pause here just for a moment. I'll be right back. So before going much further, let me just talk a little bit about, so Winslow Homer is one of the most famous of these people who paint scenes of the American Civil War that are then turned into engravings and illustrations for things like Harper's Weekly. But let me talk a little bit about the differences of the uses of various media at this time. And what I mean by this is that painting, more often than not, was used to show scenes of the war in ways that downplayed the violence, that downplayed any kind of bloodshed. I mean, this was a painful, painful war. People were losing relatives on both sides. It's a massive impact, on young men of this time in particular. And it was so horrifying to so many people that they didn't really want to pick up their weekly magazine and see those scenes. As a matter of fact, after a few scenes were released early on from the one medium that showed the violence, photography, even the photographers tended to pull away from representing these scenes. Now the thing was, so when you see scenes of these, the paintings, and it's primarily people at leisure, especially during the Civil War, there's a reason for that. People just didn't want to be reminded of the bloody reality that was around them all the time. The photographers tended to show scenes that emphasized the brutality of the war, or the aftermath of a battle, because again, photography is at its nascent stage and it can't really capture action scenes in any way. In fact, photography is oftentimes manipulating the scenes to tell a very particular narrative. That wasn't going to show up in these periodicals. And honestly, it couldn't show up very easily, just so you know. And I went back and forth about showing you some photography, but you're going to have to take my course on the history of photography if you want to see those. It's a pretty interesting moment. Photography at this stage couldn't easily be reprinted. You couldn't just take a photographic negative and turn it into a positive in a periodical. It had to go through a process of actually being turned into an engraving or a photograph, which is a particular process, and it would take weeks, if not months, to get that done. And so it's not like it was set up for reporting events at the time. In any case, so Winslow Homer fits perfectly into this, and here you've got a work called The Bright Side. Remember, he's painting these little kind of fairly quick pictures that then get turned over to other people to turn to into engravings. And this is done near the end of the Civil War in 65. In The Bright Side, you basically see 5 black soldiers, 4 lying against the tent. Kind of, again, the title comes from they're enjoying the sun in their faces. And then you see one just stepping out of the tent here. Supposedly, Winslow Homer witnessed this very scene. He was actually painting a scene of the 4 reclining men, and at the last moment, the man stuck his head out of the tent, and so he asked him to pose so he could capture that. Now, whether he intended it or not, as your text goes into, there were likely some... well, it's certainly the case that he was opening this up to the interpretation based upon prejudices of the time that blacks were lazy. This is a very, very standard argument, frankly, which, I don't know exactly where this comes from, since blacks were forced to be slaves and work, constantly in order to support our economy. But the idea was that blacks were insolent and lazy. And so many people interpreted what he was showing here as corresponding to that prejudice. And in particular, these men are actually teamsters, so the ones who move the donkeys in particular along, but also horses to move the wagons. And you see those donkeys in the background here. Blacks were oftentimes compared to donkeys. If you've ever been around a donkey, they're pretty stubborn, and that was associated with them being lazy too, because usually the way a donkey's stubborn is it won't move for you, right? You have to really force it to move, and that kind of correspondence was pretty common at this time. And so people oftentimes would interpret scenes like this according to, again, their viewpoints. Whether Winslow Homer was intending to do this or not is, I suppose, a matter of debate, but the number of times he plays into, especially during the Civil War, these stereotypes, my bets are on he knew at least a bit of what he was up to. The one thing, though, again, before I go on, one thing that maybe runs counter to that argument a little bit is that these blacks are not shown as types, right? They're all clearly individuals, and that's certainly different than what he had done, about 6 years earlier in the Bivouac Fire. Here's what they would be turned into. So he would paint a scene, then he'd turn it over, and engravers, this really cheap engraving process, or lithographers, which is another form of printing, would turn it into something like this, and it would get published in the weekly periodical. One of his most famous works, and the one that your text goes into a number of different interpretations on that I'm going to leave for you to read there, is this famous work called Prisoners from the Front. It's a work that was actually painted following the Civil War, and it's one of the ways that the United States sought to mend and come to understand what had happened during the Civil War was both through literature and through paintings. Even plays were put on about these things. In this famous scene, what we see is off to the right-hand side, you see a Union leader, and off to the left-hand side are his captured Southerners. In the middle here with the gun kind of separating the two is the prison guard. So what are their types and what do these things mean? Well, the standard interpretation of this, and again there are many of them, is that we've got basically something really interesting going on. The man off to the right here, placed a little bit closer to us and obviously not being guarded, is clearly the victor. And it's very standard to put the victor over on the right-hand side of a work of art, surveying his captives. But unlike most scenes that show someone like the victorious leader, you don't have the prisoners bowing down to him. You don't have them in chains. You actually have an almost one-to-one relationship between these two, the Southern man here with his long hair and this man, and a kind of comparison between the two. They're kind of standing off to one another. Now, to me, the most kind of compelling interpretation of this is that, again, Winslow Homer is using kind of prevailing views about Southerners and Southern types in order to justify the way that the Northerners both beat them and how they were going to treat them following the war, which was meant to be sympathetic to some degree, or understanding of Southerners' tendencies, if I can put it that way. And again, these are stereotypes about Southerners. So here, this Southern male here is the young kind of rebel. He's got long hair. He's not going to put up with anyone's, telling him what to do. He's his own independent man. He's going to be rebellious, and he can even be heroic, but that's in part because he is impetuous and insolent and prone to, just doing whatever he wants to do without thinking about it. So that's who he is, and that's why they were such a, in a way, dangerous foe, says the North, full of bravery, impetuous, but ultimately that was the reason that they lost as well. But he's not backing down to anyone. Look at how the Northern leader looks at him. It's almost surveying. It's almost kind of making sense of him, taking stock of who he is and imagining how you then work with this type of mentality that can't be changed necessarily. Then behind him is maybe the most kind of, the one who is most chagrined or sad about what he's done, maybe a little bit ashamed. It's the older man, and look at the way he holds his hand in consternation, looking kind of past the young rebel man, as if to say, yeah, I'm sorry about what I did, but, I had to do it. The final one is behind that. Notice how this is all in levels of who is the most assertive, second most important, and then the third is maybe the most standard representation of Southerners during this time. That's the yokel, right? That's the not very smart Southerner. He's in the background. He's willing to be led by anyone who tells him what to do. He doesn't really think much for himself because he's not bright enough to think for himself. And again, the standard interpretation of this is these people aren't going to change. That's how they are. That's what their base kind of mentality is, their base way of operating in the world. So we as Northerners need to take account of that and figure out a way to work with it or to guide that in a productive way. And that's probably what this work's all about. Again, most of his scenes, so Rainy Day at Camp here, are scenes of, people at leisure, people kind of waiting around for something else to do to minimize the horror of these events and to really play up the idea of, the everyday activities of these soldiers. A much later work by Winslow Homer is this one. Again, you can see that kind of sketchy quality as his career went along and as modern art advanced in Europe and he became aware of it. His works kept getting more and more painterly. This is a work that's called A Visit from the Old Mistress from 1876. Again, and just briefly put, following the Civil War, of course, in many parts of particularly the South, while blacks were no longer held as slaves, they were oftentimes still working for the very families who had once held them as slaves. And this is some kind of very subtle commentary on that. The mistress has returned. She has absolute access to the homes of these black people who is very, it's a very shabby interior. It's very claustrophobic and small, pushing them together. She still has that access. She's dressed in finery. They're dressed in rags. And yet, the way that they look back at her is, in some ways, not through anger, it's open to interpretation, I would say, right? They look at her, they pay her attention. They're not quite as beholden to her as they once would have been. Notice how the woman on the far left doesn't even stand up to greet her. But on the other hand, they're not showing any kind of anger or get out of our house either. One work by a woman artist, Edmonia Lewis here. This is her most famous work called Forever Free. Edmonia Lewis is a really interesting kind of backstory. She was born to a Chippewa mother and an African-American father, but was orphaned at age 4 and then was brought up by the family of her mother, the Chippewa Nation. She got a lot of early support, as many groups of people did, by abolitionists. The abolitionist movement was very supportive of the plight of Native Americans at this time as well, and she kind of fit both bills and got some schooling education through that support, and eventually went on into the arts, where she made a great friend and patron, traveled through Italy in particular, and learned to carve marble, and that's what you're looking at here. It's a work that is all about basically freedom and emancipation, a work that is representing a black man and a black woman breaking those chains and looking up to God in thankfulness. As your text points out, and people have pointed out forever, it shows you some of the limitations of a medium like marble to represent this, in the sense that it's pretty hard to tell, because you can't get any skin pigmentation, that these are necessarily black people at all. The final work for today is, I got two more. Hugo Ball's The Emancipation Group, and then Augustus Saint-Gaudens' famous sculpture. This is the original study for the Emancipation Group. Again, I brought this in so you could see the version that's in your text is the large version that was put on public display, but you can see the close-ups of this and where he started. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, of 1863 is something that scholars have pored over for quite a bit of time. When you're in high school, you tend to learn that this is the moment in which Lincoln proclaims that all blacks are free, but that's not exactly what he did. He talked about blacks in the North, and he talked about blacks that were fighting against the South, but he didn't really talk about what was going to happen to the blacks that were in the South, or blacks that were slaves that had come into the North. In other words, it's taken to be something that it's not necessarily. And it wasn't until the, of course, 13th Amendment a year later, which was improved in 1865, that slavery is abolished completely. Now, once again, it becomes very difficult to represent the idea of emancipation without someone who is doing the emancipating. This is one of the big criticisms of works like this, especially by the cultures that are supposedly emancipated. It's as if Abraham Lincoln, of his own power, has kind of emancipated these people who should have already been free in the first place, holding his Emancipation Proclamation in his right hand over a stack of books that are associated with law and legalities, and with his left hand kind of rising up the black man beneath him. Now again, this is an almost impossible thing to represent, because on the one hand, the blacks did not at this time have the power necessary to rebel and emancipate themselves within the system as it existed. And on the other hand, you're stuck with making it seem as if they did nothing to emancipate themselves, which is, again, one of those problems that shows up in maybe the most famous monument to black soldiers during this time, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, the memorial to Robert Goldshaw and the 54th Regiment of 1897. I want to show you this from a little bit further out so you can get an idea of the scale. It's in the Boston Commons, of course. It's what's called a relief sculpture, a very high relief sculpture. Unlike sculptures such as this one that you can walk around and see from all sides, a relief sculpture is basically something that's in standing off from the wall, in this case very high relief, but it's still attached to its background so that it's oriented towards you in 2 dimensions, even though it has 3 dimensions in it. It's like sculpture that's still stuck on its background, I guess is the best way to say it. And when something's really projecting off that background, we call it high relief, and when it's barely coming off the background, we call that low relief. In this case, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment was an entirely black regimental army of the North that was led by Robert Goldshaw, who was a white general. There's a famous Hollywood movie about this with Matthew Broderick playing Shaw. Of course, Shaw and much of this regiment was killed in a famous battle. And so later on, a number of people, starting with a couple of prominent blacks in Massachusetts, and then a whole group of people put in money to have this major monument made to commemorate this major contribution by black soldiers to their own emancipation. The way this is set up is at the very top you've got, and let me get you in closer here, whoops. At the very top, you have the angel of death. After all, many of these people are going to perish, who holds in her hand here poppies and a laurel, and that laurel is something that's turned into a laurel crown and is representative of victory, whereas poppies are symbols of sleep or death here. And then right down below her, prominent in the foreground, is Robert Goldshaw on his horse. This is a standard equestrian monument. Those equestrian monuments were going up all over the East Coast at this time. And then about 20 years later, in the early 20th century, even more went up in Confederate states, those ones that are coming down, as part of, frankly, a propaganda kind of rewriting of history and a heroizing of all of these generals of the South. Equestrian monuments are monuments in which you've got the leader sitting astride his horse, as I've said before. This is symbolic of his ability to lead, in this case the army. Just as he can lead his horse, he leads his army into battle. He's given pride of place, isn't he? His head is much above the others. In fact, they only go up to his waist. He's pushed into the foreground. He's in the highest relief. It really puts everything, all the emphasis on the leader, who is the one white man in this regiment. In the background are the soldiers, and on the one hand, they're all very accurately represented as individuals, which is wonderful, right? But on the other hand, as your text points out, many people at the time were concerned about this as well. They're placed behind the white general. Their legs mimic and follow the same kind of path as the horse's legs. making a correspondence between blacks and animals that was just frankly far too common at this time, as we've already seen. And so it led a lot of people to be a little bit concerned with the way that this erstwhile memorial to this famous black regiment still seemed to carry some of the prejudices or problems of representation that had been around for quite a while. This is a close-up to show you some more of the detail. Augustus Saint-Gauden is an incredibly accomplished sculptor. He was famous for creating these types of memorials. And, technically speaking, he did a great job here representing this. I tend to think that, these things are products of their ages. So on the one hand, it's very common when you're representing a regiment to emphasize the leader. You're always going to do that. Just so happens to be the case in this circumstance that leader is a white man, the only white man in this group, and the rest are all blacks. The other one is, I don't quite buy the idea, although I get it, that you are visually corresponding these blacks with a horse, and that's very common at the time. They're both beasts of burden in the popular imagination of this time. But remember, too, that artistically, artists are thinking about things like rhythm and correspondence and repetition of forms. And I think the artist is, at least at the level of intention, and that doesn't kind of let him off the hook, more interested in making everything look like it's moving forward in an orderly and very rigorous pattern, both for artistic reasons, but also because, of course, soldiers walking in a cadence with this march all in unison, that's an indication of how well disciplined they are, how well trained they are. And that, in this instance, is actually a good thing. Well, again, there are tons more of images of the Civil War, but in a survey class, that's what we have time for this week. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you at the next lecture.